The last victim of Jack the Ripper. Written by Petr Macek, music by Daniel Barták, read by Jamie Marshall. Our worst nightmare resurfaced only a few months after I had finally stopped waking in the middle of the night with my mind full of horrific images and jerking with fright at every unexpected murmur. The reign of the bestial killer, known to the public as Jack the Ripper, was over. And although I will most likely never be able to fully disclose the details of Holmes's involvement in the investigation of those heinous murders, nor the identity of their perpetrator, I was certain that the terrifying period, culminating in the latter half of 1888, was over. I will only say that our shared secret of national importance only strengthened the degree of mutual trust between myself and Sherlock Holmes. Even now, decades later, as I look back on this case, I can think of no other that has brought us closer together. I assume that there is no one among my readers who is unfamiliar with the basic outlines of the entire mysterious case, so I do not intend to recount it in detail. The articles, the endless stream of new scholarly publications and novels inspired by the murders of easy women on the fringes of society, seem unlikely to disappear from the shelves of newsagents and booksellers even decades from now. After solving the case, I asked myself whether the souls of the 5 unfortunate women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly, had ever found peace. Their murderer may have been identified thanks to Holmes, but he escaped classic secular justice by divine intervention. Frankly, I have been unable to give an honest reply to my question. Indeed, I myself was frustrated that in the eyes of the common folk, the shadow of Jack the Ripper had vanished into thin air without anyone having been officially charged, even though the newspapers had gradually dragged the names of several suspects through the mud without any direct evidence. Those more knowledgeable may wonder why I mentioned 5 victims when there were allegedly many more. Indeed, there were several suspicious deaths in the broader vicinity at the time, but the threads leading directly from them to our killer were never proven beyond a shadow of doubt or documented. Regardless of how many heinous acts Jack the Ripper committed, the law incriminated him for 5 deaths, and Holmes proved exactly the same number. That is why it occurred to me, in the spring of 1889, whether the events I am now about to put on record for the first time may have been a portent from hell from those 5 women, making their displeasure known to us. For it was then that yet another body appeared. The alleged 6th victim was found in the early hours of the morning in mid-March of 1889 in Pelham Street at Whitechapel, not far from the location we were better acquainted with than we would have liked following the previous year's investigation. Before the panic could spread, Inspector Lestrade had a cab sent for us. It brought us to the scene on that Monday morning, even before the arrival of Melville McNaughton, Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police Criminal Investigation Service, and Inspector Frederick Aberline, whom we had worked with on the Jack the Ripper case last year. "How can this be, Holmes?" I asked as we travelled to the scene, shivering in part from the bitter cold morning, in part from the unevenness of the cobblestones, and in part from sheer anxiety. "We got the Ripper off the streets. There is no way he can still be killing." My friend, bundled in his blankets, kept his gaze fixed out of the window. was looking at nothing in particular. Different scenes were unfolding before his eyes. And yet, we are presently on our way to see another body, he said quietly. From the moment we had been awakened and dragged out of bed, a thought had been weighing on me that I couldn't shake. What if we accused the wrong man back then? I blurted. Clearly, we were both thinking the same thing. What can I say, Watson? He sighed. I am not so conceited as to think that I can never be wrong. But I do have a natural confidence in my abilities, and however much I reassess my deduction, I don't believe I made a mistake. We must first obtain more data. I refuse to make hasty judgments and revise my conclusions so quickly. He was right, of course. But even so, uneasiness had become sown in my soul, and I, for one, did not arrive at the scene of the crime with a clear and unprejudiced mind, as would have been proper in view of the situation. The carriage dropped us as close as possible to the site of the crime, as far as it could get, but even so, the detective and I were obliged to walk down a stretch of narrow alley on our own. Our feet sank into a mixture of rubbish, mud, and slops. Fortunately, none of the locals paid us any heed. Those who were already awake headed for a dark alcove by the door of a crumbling house, which was even now surrounded by a cordon of police. Laying there like a discarded rag doll was the deceased, a dark-haired young woman in a plain dress of forget-me-not blue, which the blood had soaked through in several patches to create dark patterns on the fabric. There was so much of the life-giving fluid around her that there could not have been much left in her body. It was consistent with the fact that those parts of the face and skin that weren't obscured or covered with a crust of dried, smeared blood were almost white. We had not long since asked ourselves how any man could be capable of such a thing. Outwardly, at least, we must have appeared dispassionate to the onlookers. Who discovered it? Holmes promptly asked Lestrade, who was waiting for us. The inspector beckoned to a constable pacing nearby, who told us how he'd almost tripped over the body during his morning rounds, for it lay largely in the dark. Even on a clear day, the sun could not reach in among the cramped houses, let alone in the dim light of the cool dawn of coming spring. I bent down to the poor woman to get a better look, brushing the matted hair from her forehead. Her eyes, almost as pale as her skin, showed a look of horror. Much of her face was smeared with blood from a long gash on her neck. Other abrasions and bruises were visible in several places on her neck and nape. Her attacker had apparently strangled her first, and then slit her throat. The blood, spurting from the artery as from a pump, had also splattered onto the wall of the alcove, down which it ran in rivulets. Even more of it oozed out from under the body from a second wound, the one that took us back in time by a quarter of a year, the wound that had prompted Lestrade to summon us. For the case appeared to be no ordinary murder, but the work of Jack the Ripper. The dead woman's skirt was pulled up above her pelvis, which had been transformed into a mush of skin, flesh, and tissue. Her womb has been excised, I announced to Holmes. Very crudely and unsparingly, I would say. In any case, when the medical examiner arrives, I would suggest an autopsy, which will tell us more. The words addressed to the detective and the inspector were overheard by the group of onlookers. One of the women issued an agonized yelp and almost fainted. Only a quick-witted constable saved her from collapsing into the muddy morass. My friend walked up to the woman and patted her smudged cheek slightly. "Come on, wake up," he encouraged her. "Judging by reaction, I believe you know who it is." She groaned weakly, but recovered her senses and nodded apprehensively. Her name was Monica Langley," she whispered fearfully. You knew her well? She was my roommate. Do you live nearby? Around the corner just there. She pointed over her shoulder into what was perhaps an even narrower alcove. Interesting, Holmes mused, rubbing his chin. Watson, can you determine when the murder took place? I would say shortly before dawn, a few hours ago at the most. I deemed, judging by the onset of rigor mortis in the corpse. The same modus operandi as always, exclaimed an attentive Lestrade, eager to have something to report to his superiors. Including the location chosen by the killer, a public place at a time when there was minimal danger of being disturbed. He was waiting for her as she returned home, the detective added. I assume, given the nature of her occupation, that she spent her nights outdoors, he stated, focusing on the witness again. Was this your usual turf? He spoke not from any distrust of the young and comparatively presentable ladies living in the neighbourhood, who after thorough washing might readily have graced the salons of even the wealthiest men, but simply from experience. Every one of Jack the Ripper's victims to date had been engaged in or associated with prostitution, which was why the killer repeatedly, albeit in not all cases, mutilated their bodies in a manner similar to what he'd done to Monica Langley. The woman, however, objected. I'm no whore. Her cheeks flushed. I'm a respectable woman. May I know what your livelihood is? I'm a waitress down at the pub. Holmes grimaced doubtfully. And Miss Langley? I can't speak for her, she continued, frowning. True, she wasn't home last night, but I never pried. She paid her dues, so what do I care what she did? May we visit your rooms? When she nodded, my friend turned to Lestrade. Please make a note of this woman's address in case your colleague should wish to question her as well. The doctor and I will examine her quarters now and then see what happens. Should your men need me, I will be glad to be of service to them with my observations. Of course, knowing Inspector Abberline, he will want to follow his own clues and pursue the case on his own. As you please, Mr. Holmes, agreed the inspector. I wanted you to see it for yourself, but you mustn't be surprised if Abberline and McNaughton don't take advantage of your help at this time. We may have been too quick in accepting your solution last time, whereas all the while, the real Jack was waiting for us to drop our guard so he could draw his knife again. This time, we won't be taken in by your fanciful deductions. The detective did not deign to comment. Then I have only one piece of advice for you, he said. Keep the newspaper hounds at bay for the present. You too will find it easier to work without a general uproar. Lestrade took the advice, saying he was no novice, and graciously dismissed us. We accompanied the woman, whom the inspector had jotted down as Shannon Hamblin, to her lodgings, situated roughly halfway down the block adjacent to Pelham Street. The rough-hewn door did very little to keep out the cold or the rats, let alone uninvited visitors. Then again, there was probably nothing to steal in a hovel like this. Shannon and Monica lived on the first story in a cramped room with only the most basic of amenities. A wash basin, a pitcher of water that was far from clean, a few garments hanging on lines, and a rickety chair. The two young women had slept on a single mattress on the floor, with a pillow of rags and a rough blanket. The room was heated with a small cast-iron stove, and differed but little from how most of the inhabitants of this poor neighbourhood lived in those days. Monica only moved in a few weeks ago, the lass told us. She'd stopped in for a drink at the King's Head, which is where I work, and asked if I knew of a place to stay. So I offered to let her stay with me for a while. I'm never in during the day. I come back late, and every penny counts, right? Did she tell you anything about herself?
Like I said, we basically took turns. Shannon shook her head. I slept here at night. She slept here in the mornings. We didn't have much opportunity to gossip. Not that she was the sort, a withdrawn, sullen and happy woman she was. But then again, ain't we all? Not much to be happy about round here.
What do you think she did for a living?
The woman mused. Can't say. But I don't really think she was selling herself.
What makes you say that?
She never, when she come home, and we did spend time together, she never smelled of any man. And believe me, I've a nose for those things, she confided. She didn't have any diseases neither, like the crabs or such. I made sure.
Quite so, Holmes reflected. Where are her personal effects? Shannon pointed to a hanging dress.
Other than what she was wearing, she only brought her purse, a little silver locket of sorts, but I don't see them anywhere. She looked around.
I'm certain there was nothing around her neck, I said, reviewing my examination in my mind. To date, the Ripper has never taken any trophies from his victims, the detective mused. Of course, it's quite possible that the young woman simply dropped it and it's lying in the mud somewhere. Let us see if Abeline's people discover it. The rickety boards creaked under my feet as I crossed the little room. Holmes cast me a reproachful glance, as though I were distracting him, but then paused. Something about the floor intrigued him. He stooped where the planking was visibly ill-fitting and took a hold of it. The plank lifted slightly without offering any resistance. A black purse lay in the hollow beneath.
Here, here,
he exclaimed joyfully, lifting the purse from its hiding place and opening it. Inside was a thick wad of notes.
That's mine.
Hamblin held out a hand greedily for them. Even I could tell she was lying. The detective smiled. What a remarkable coincidence. Just when we were searching for Miss Langley's purse, we find yours. Surely you know how much money there is in there. He hid the money behind his back and waited to see how the respectable woman would react.
I've not counted it.
Approximately, at least, he prompted her as she remained silent and gritted her teeth in annoyance.
Very well, then. I suppose it is Monica's, the woman said resignedly. I had no idea she was so flush with money. But surely you're not surprised that I tried me luck.
She attempted what was supposed to be an apology.
Won't do her no good anyway.
As you have essentially proved to be helpful, I shall overlook this attempt at deception, said Holmes, slipping the purse under his coat. The money will remain with me, and I will hand it over to the police. It might be a vital piece of evidence. Of what? I asked curiously. Do not get ahead of yourself, my dear Watson, he admonished me. Miss Hamblin, one last question. Can you think of anyone who might know more about Monica after all?
Well, Frank O'Neill was quite taken with her. But surely he didn't kill her. He's just a clumsy oaf. He was at the pub when Monica first showed up, and he never took his eyes off her. Just yesterday, she complained that he kept following her about.
Excellent, Mum, the detective rejoiced.
Doctor, would you be so kind, if you have any spare change on you? This does indeed deserve a reward, he requested.
I dropped the few coins I had in my pockets into Hamblin's hand, and we returned to the alley. From there, however, we started off in the opposite direction from which we'd come, away from the dead woman's body and the growing swarm of police officers. From a distance, I could see Abeline, who had finally deigned to appear, barking orders and shooing away the intrusive curious onlookers and sensation hunters. Shouldn't we give them the money?
I inquired, hurrying after Holmes, who dashed off. I should like to find Mr. O'Neill first, he replied. I expect him to be at the King's Head. That place never closes, and its regulars seldom leave. If the police question Hamblin, she will surely tell them about the money. His reluctance to help the yard after what Lestrade had said was obvious. Would it not be better to get a handle on the suspects we put together in the previous Ripper investigation first? I attempted to be rational. You heard them. They do not need my help. Indeed, they scorn it, he snorted. They can manage on their own. What you suggest is clerical for someone as unimaginative as Abeline. I believe the key to the murderer lies in the dead woman's past. Murderer? We know who he is. Jack the Ripper, I exclaimed. The detective glanced warily about the street, teeming with a motley assembly of local laundrymaids, servants, coachmen, labourers, tramps, and more. All of them had yet another joyless day to survive. Their heads began turning towards us. You must speak even louder, hissed Holmes. There's a drunkard asleep on the pavement who didn't hear you. I stumbled silently behind the fuming detective for a moment. It was still relatively early in the morning, but life in the peripheral streets of the metropolis was already throbbing with a pulse of feverish activity. Some of the merchants were already displaying their wares. Others were only just raising the shutters of their shops with a clatter. Even in the advancing light, however, the streets of Whitechapel were gloomy, dreary, broken down and reeking of a mixture of odours I had no desire to identify. Question marks, I should think, hover over both the killer and the motive. Does it not strike you as odd that Langley had so much money hidden under the floorboards? I can't help but wonder, the detective continued after a few minutes when no one could hear us. She might have been saving up for a better life, I suggested. Those banknotes hardly look like something she saved up. I've counted the money, and it's far more than a poor soul like her could ever have earned. What's more, it's a pretty little round sum. No, it is either money she found, or far more likely, money she was given for something. So a prostitute after all. For that amount, you could get the loveliest debutante, not some stodgy piece of work like Miss Langley, he argued. Listening to Holmes, I had to admit he was right. It was all rather puzzling. With that kind of money, she could have afforded a much nicer place to live. You speak my mind, Watson, he said gleefully, as if I'd torn a blindfold from my eyes. What does that imply? That the motive for her death may be the same as the reason she didn't spend the money. I believe she intended to pay it back. Whatever the reward may have been, Miss Langley seems to have changed her mind. Judging by the amount, it must have been something very substantial indeed. Which is why she went out every night. I pursued his line of reasoning. Was she involved in the plotting of some crime or other, and then got scared? It's not impossible, admitted the detective. Now we only need to find out how the Ripper fits in, I exclaimed. That O'Neill chap who's been stalking her must have known where she's been going. He might have seen someone approach her. To this, my friend made no further reply, for we were under the signboard at the King's Head. Although less than an hour had passed since Shannon Hamblin had named the victim in front of the crowd of loafers, and we had hurried straight to the public house from her abode, the news had arrived before we did. The grapevine of the street had taken care of it. The tavern guests were despondent. Instead of the usual boisterous imbibing, their only escape from the troubles of everyday life, there was now furtive whispering, if there was any talk at all,
No one sang, no one played. The prospect that the serial killer had reappeared on the streets constricted everyone's throats. However, it was not enough to prevent Frank O'Neill, whom we recognized by the description, from swallowing several glasses of the cheapest liquor to quench his pain and anguish. We sat down at his table, one on each side. There was plenty of room, for as soon as his cronies saw us approaching, they promptly rose from their seats. Holmes's face was no longer anonymous, nor was his service to law and order, and few of the local patrons had a clear conscience. But none of the others interested us today. Mr. O'Neill, I understand you're going through a difficult time, but surely you too want to help Miss Langley's murderer to be caught. We need your help, Holmes addressed him. The man in ragged and threadbare clothes barely noticed us and merely took a sip from his glass of clear liquid. Even at a distance, I could smell the pungent odor of strong liquor. First off, I must ask you what you were doing last night, the detective continued. I don't want to interfere, gentlemen. The red-haired innkeeper approached us, clutching half a dozen foaming pints in one hand and a rag in the other. But he won't tell you much. He's been drinking since yesterday. Been at it all night. When the news about the girl came, he stopped talking altogether. He automatically set 2 glasses in front of us and continued on his route, which began and ended at the tap. Along the way, he exchanged the empty mugs for full ones. I leaned inconspicuously towards O'Neill and examined his boots, trousers, and waistcoat. They apparently hadn't seen a washboard and soap in months, and there was plenty of dirt and mud on them, but no sign of blood. Nor were his hands, which could have loaded a coal wagon but recently how dirty they were, those of someone who'd committed the butchery. Holmes made the same judgment. I hear you followed her round. Why? Holmes inquired, shaking the man. He sobbed. No, I didn't want her to come to any harm. She was so beautiful. It is essential that you tell us when you last saw her. Where did she go? O'Neill took another drink, but his lips had ceased to obey his mind. The spirit dribbled from his mouth down his chin, wetting his bedraggled beard. She told me to bugger off, that she didn't ever want to lay eyes on me again. He droned on. She said she was sick of all men. He poured his heart out, but slurring his words to such a degree that they were almost unintelligible. Where did she go? The detective repeated, his voice raised in urgency. Somewhere in Knightsbridge, almost every night, but I always lost her, the drunkard managed to mutter before his head fell face down on the tabletop. I looked up. The neighbourhood in question is the polar opposite of Whitechapel. Many of London's richest people reside there. And if she hadn't been working for somebody there, the murdered woman must have looked as out of place as if Queen Victoria had stepped out of a carriage in the East End. If she was involved in anything that was going on in Knightsbridge, it was surely an important affair. Why, it's nearly 2 hours' walk, I exclaimed. It is a testimony to Miss Langley's determination that she made the journey every night. We must go at once, decided Holmes. We paid for the ale, which we hadn't even touched, and whistled for a cab to take us away from the hovel. I confess I was relieved when we pulled into the wider streets of the city centre with their tidy cobblestones and bright facades. We should focus on all the major events going on in Knightsbridge, like art or jewellery exhibitions. She might also have been spying on a jewellery store or checking on the police officers' rounds, where they are at what time, I suggested. Holmes listened to me with an air of delight regarding my plan, but not for long. Unless the deed has already been done, he demolished my theory. As we were already passing through the streets of Knightsbridge, He stopped the cab, and we set off on foot. We were heading for the local police station, but in the end we were spared the visit, for we met one of the senior officers of the constabulary with whom we had collaborated on a case in the past, and who held my friend in high esteem. We discussed the matter with him from all aspects, but to no avail. We've not dealt with any major robberies lately, and there'll be no guarded exhibitions in the coming days or weeks, mused the policeman. I was just resigning myself to the idea that we would have to go round all the jewellery shops in person, and there were quite a few in this neighbourhood, to inquire about any forthcoming major deliveries of wares, when Holmes asked the officer a crucial question. By the way, officer, have you ever heard the name Monica Langley? Langley, the officer mused. What, you mean the tramp? That would be the one, the detective said. Have you met her? Well, not in person. I only know her name from reports. A completely intoxicated woman had been disturbing the peace for several nights in succession. Lord Catelman even filed a complaint about a person of that name. My men went to fetch her from outside his house and explained to her emphatically that she had no business in our neighbourhood. She was talking nonsense, but our men shut her foul mouth. He laughed cynically. I didn't dare to imagine what such a reprimand might have looked like, and glanced instead at my watch. By this time, the doctor was surely taking the body in for an autopsy. At least half of the bruises on the body would not have been perpetrated by the killer. Holmes's warmth likewise faded at these words, and we parted with the policeman coldly. I believe he failed to realize that he had said something we could not approve of, and he merely saluted politely and strode off to his duties. Lord Catelman is one of the wealthiest residents of Knightsbridge, mused the detective, so we know who she had set her sights on. Shall we pay him a visit? Naturally, he replied. Our investigation has just taken an unexpected turn. Whatever do you mean? Until now, we have assumed she came here to observe someone or something. That requires stealth. But she was disturbing the peace of the night, and on the contrary, calling attention to herself quite volubly. Another mystery that doesn't fit into our theories at all. Perhaps we can find out from his lordship why she behaved as she did. The elderly Mr. Catelman resided in a magnificent Victorian house near Hyde Park. After ringing the bell, a rather stuffy butler answered the door, annoyed that we'd come at a rather inconvenient time, as the gentleman was about to take his luncheon. We shan't be but a minute. We only want to know why you summoned the police, Holmes told him. I don't believe I understand you, the man said sternly. According to the report, Lord Catelman summoned the police to deal with a certain Monica Langley who was making a nuisance of herself in front of your house, the detective reiterated, repeating what he knew from the policeman. I can assure you that in 20 years I have served and lived in this house. There's been no such scandal or any other, scowled the butler still more, and was about to slam the door when a young industrious maid appeared behind his back, having overheard our conversation. I expect the gentleman would like to see Mr. Catelman's son. Monica used to be in his service, she said. That may be, admitted the detective. The young gentleman and his family live elsewhere. You must go several streets over. The butler referred us to another address. I was not aware that the young Lord Catelman also owned a house in this neighbourhood, I said in surprise. He only recently received it from his father when his wife finally came with child and bore him an heir, escaped the maid's mouth. The old man wanted peace and quiet, but he also wanted to keep them nearby. He adores the little one. Why, he was miserable before for fear that the family lineage would die out on the Spear side.
He was even considering going so far as to punish and disinherit the young master.
That's quite enough, miss. The butler shushed her quickly. You're not at market here nor in the social column of some tabloid rag. Such indiscretion is strictly out of the question. And you, gentlemen, be on your way. Hence we found ourselves back on the street and proceeded to move on to the next address. I'm beginning to feel that things are getting increasingly convoluted and we are getting somewhat distracted from the murder investigation. We will hardly find the Ripper here after all, I complained as fatigue and frustration crept over me. In spite of the gravity of the situation, Holmes laughed, rather inappropriately to my taste. Indeed, whereas I believe this will be our final visit, which will provide us with some rather significant answers, he predicted. I trusted he was not mistaken. Unfortunately, it wasn't all that simple. Everett Catelman, what can I do for you, gentlemen? The tall, blonde aristocrat with angular features and prominent cheekbones said, introducing himself. We are here on behalf of one Monica Langley, announced Holmes in the anteroom of the man's house, which was indeed no more than a 15-minute walk from his father's residence. Catelman did not bat an eyelid. I'm afraid I'm not acquainted with any such person, he said. The detective cleared his throat dryly without letting his bemusement show. Rather odd, considering you summoned the police to deal with a person of that very name but a few days ago, he remarked. All the more so, as she is your former housemaid. The Lord's skin, already rather pale, seemed to become even paler, but he continued to maintain an admirable poker face. Ah, that one, he exclaimed, remembering suddenly. Many servants have come and gone through my house, and I cannot possibly remember them all. But it is true that this young woman made some trouble. What sort of trouble? Catelman noticed that the maid who had come to open the door had remained in the hall with us, her ears very much perked. Come in, gentlemen. I do not care to discuss this matter in the doorway, he beckoned. And you, Lynette, fetch us some tea. Then you can set the table for lunch. We were ushered into the drawing room, where a slight woman sat in a chair by a tall window. She was cradling an infant in her arms, a boy, judging by the blue colour of his swaddling clothes, who could not have been more than a few weeks old. She was softly humming a melodious lullaby and stroking his dark, thick hair affectionately. My wife Gladys, the Lord introduced her. Lady Catelman glanced at us, putting a forefinger to her lips as a sign that we should not wake the child. She took him gently and carried him off to a quieter part of the house. He is the apple of our eye, a darling child, the proud father beamed, taking a seat on the divan. As we settled in, I noticed that he had a slight limp. Before the maid brought in the teapot and the 3 cups, we exchanged a few pleasantries, as 2 war veterans, about where we had served and what injuries we had sustained, while the detective perused the family portraits on the wall. Then, without further ado, he began speaking. I had the sense that he didn't care to give his lordship too much time to prepare his answers. Let us return to Miss Langley, he requested. You mentioned certain difficulties. I do not wish to smear the affair, as I wouldn't like to cause her any more trouble. Catelman waved his hand. Her work ethic was far from exemplary, and we did not part on good terms. She is a temperamental young woman, and she used to come here to vent her anger. Nothing to occupy the mind of a private investigator. We are here because she was murdered. In a very brutal fashion, I might add, said Holmes. You must admit that this is worthy of my attention. The nobleman, pouring himself some tea, started and spilled it over his trousers and part of the table. He seemed genuinely surprised by the information. But my friend was a far better reader of human reactions with a great deal more experience. However, he did not let on whether he perceived it as a guise or genuine surprise?
I'm sorry to hear that, naturally, Kettleman said, but I had nothing to do with it.
The detective drew out his handkerchief and spread it over the spilled tea before it soaked into his trousers or into a pile of letters laying on the ledge of the table under a paperweight.
Leave that alone. Lynette'll take care of it.
The Lord rang the bell to summon the maid. Holmes had not yet finished. He reached into his coat and took out the purse stuffed with banknotes.
"Do you know where she could have obtained so much money?"
he asked, showing it to our host.
"Indeed I do not," Kettleman retorted brusquely. "Why are you asking me all about this anyway?"
"Because you are the only person of her acquaintance who could dispose of such a sum." His lordship looked offended.
"Acquaintance? I beg you, I haven't seen that woman for 3/4 of a year. We were not acquainted, as you put it. I do not wish her any harm, but after how she behaved, I am sincerely relieved that my family will finally find peace."
"Very well, then. I can think of no further questions for the present," Holmes added meaningfully. We were shown out, but the detective paused again on the threshold. "I understand that it must be unpleasant for someone in your position to be associated with a murder, let alone of a girl so far beneath you on the social ladder. But I must warn you that the circumstances of her death are of interest to those in the highest places. You may soon receive a visit from my colleagues at the Metropolitan Police. I am certain they will do their utmost not to cause a scandal." Everett Kettleman took note of Holmes's words, and undoubtedly hoped that he would never see us again. We crossed the busy street to the outskirts of Hyde Park, where a refreshment stand stood in the shade of the trees.
"Would you care for a sandwich, Watson?"
the detective asked. I had little appetite after the morning's exploits and examination of the corpse, but could not deny that my stomach had started growling.
"Excellent," he acknowledged. "I suggest you enjoy it here on the bench. In the meantime, I would like to ascertain something. We shall meet again, say at 4 o'clock, outside the city morgue. Do you agree?"
I had no reason to object.
"But you insist that I have my lunch right here?"
"If you would indulge me. You see, from here you have an ideal vantage point to observe the entrance of the Kettleman residence. I want to test whether my words truly left him as indifferent as he pretended to be, or whether they provoked him into action." I recognized the ruse and selected a roast beef and pickle sandwich on brown bread from the stand. I'd been assigned to considerably less appealing stations than sitting on a sunny bench in a city park on a chilly late morning, so I was quite content. Holmes departed, and I chose a bench for lunch from which I had a clear view of the street, while myself remaining inconspicuous. For half an hour, nothing at all happened, and I was beginning to think the detective's experiment had failed, either because Kettleman indeed had naught to do with Langley and her death, or because he had excellent nerves. Then, suddenly, the door opened, and his lordship stepped out. He was wearing only a light coat, suggesting he didn't intend to venture very far. My first thought was that he was going to visit his father, but it was not so. He looked around stealthily and walked briskly down the street. At Hyde Park Corner, however, he stepped into an intersection and headed straight for the park, where I nearly lost him, but his tall figure in a top hat, characterized by a swaying gait, soon reappeared in one of the tree-lined lanes heading into the deeper reaches of the park. Further away from the crowd, the young lord slowed down. His leg injury would likely have prevented him from keeping up so brisk a pace for long. Consequently, I had no trouble following him to the deserted Serpentine. There, he looked around again before pulling something from his pocket and hurling it into the water. We had to retrieve it. I stared intently at the spot where the object had sunk, and once Kettleman was gone, I marked it with branches carefully positioned on the bank. Then I set off to fetch a gang of street urchins who were kicking a ball around on a lawn not far off. I know it's rather chilly, but if you can fish something out of the lake, you will earn a handsome reward. I coaxed them, encouraging them by holding up a shiny sovereign. They did not require much persuading, and I led them back to the body of water that divides Hyde Park in two and showed them where to search. "Is this some sort of challenge? You couldn't have dropped anything far from that shore," said one of the cocky, imp-eyed boys with his arms folded defiantly across his chest. When I doubled the promised reward, the boys obediently threw off their overcoats and jumped into the water in naught but their undergarments. I felt somewhat ashamed, but from a purely medical perspective, I decided that such bracing would do them no harm. After all, it was March already, and not the dead of winter. After a few minutes of diving, the chilled boys with chattering teeth brought me what I was looking for and handed it over in exchange for the money. In my wet palm glistened a silver locket, the very one described as belonging to Miss Langley. It could only mean that Lord Catelman was Jack the Ripper. I could hardly wait until 4 o'clock, when Holmes and I were to meet outside the morgue. I thought he'd come out from inside, assuming that he would have gone in to hear the results of the autopsy from a medical examiner. But to my surprise, he was only just heading in. "Let us go together, Watson. Your opinion is important to me," he called from the cab that had just delivered him to our destination. I was eager to inform him at the earliest opportunity of my discovery, which de facto incriminated Catelman. But before he could pay the coachman and turn his attention to me, Lestrade emerged from the morgue. "What are you gentlemen doing here?" he inquired haughtily. "A case, perhaps?" he added sardonically. "I'm rather interested in what conclusions your doctor has drawn in the Langley case," the detective replied in greeting. "I'm afraid I can't tell you that," the inspector dismissed him with a self-important air. "At Chief Constable Norton's request, we will tie up the case ourselves, this time to a victorious end, may I point out. Aberline is sure of it. We've pinched that Polish Jew before, and he's no alibi this time. There will be no escaping the noose." He was referring to Aaron Kosminski, one of the prime suspects during the original search for the Ripper, along with Thomas Cutbush, an adult medic suffering from syphilis, and Charles Lechmere, a butcher. All the suspects at the time shared a deep-rooted hatred of women and severe psychological disorders, but there was no irrefutable evidence against any of them, and Holmes finally pointed the finger at someone else entirely. "I can only advise you not to be too hasty," Holmes warned him. "Like you, isn't that right? Don't worry, we're in no danger of that. We're professionals." "And quite so. I have no need to see the results of the autopsy anyway. I know what they contain." With this statement, the detective utterly disarmed the inspector. "Oh? Let's hear it then," Lestrade sneered. At the crime scene, Dr. Watson here already noted that Monica Langley had been killed somewhat less expertly than Jack the Ripper's previous victims. Whereas before, the killer had worked with obvious knowledge of anatomy and precision, this time he was driven by rage. Several older bruises from a brutal cudgel beating were also found on her body. And I suspect it is not without interest that the lady had recently given birth. The inspector opened the report he was carrying under his arm and glared at my friend. "How can you possibly know this? I only got the report myself a few minutes ago." "I am a professional," the detective replied jovially, and tipped his hat in farewell. We left Lestrade standing dumbstruck on the pavement outside the morgue, taking advantage of the fact that the cab Holmes had taken had not yet departed. We leapt in, and the detective gave the address from which I had just arrived. "How do you know she was pregnant?" "Patience, my friend. We shall be on the spot in a moment, and I will lay it all out for you there." "So you already know it was Catelman?" I should say it's practically a certainty. How did you fare? Was your mission a success? I described to him all that had occurred near the little lake in the park and handed him the locket. Excellent, Watson, excellent indeed, he complimented me. As always, you have proved yourself most helpful. Not at all. It was your genius that led you to realize that Catelman was the Ripper. I returned the compliment. We've finally got him. Holmes was astonished. The Ripper? Who ever said he was the Ripper? Why, you just said so. My dear doctor, your and Lestrade's obsession with the Ripper prevents you from seeing things in a broader context, he complained. Let us go over the facts together. All of Jack the Ripper's proven victims were fallen women, correct? There can be no argument about that. And what do we know about Miss Langley? Well, she wasn't a prostitute, but an ordinary housemaid who conversely kept men at bay, I admitted. Besides, the Ripper demonstrated countless times that he attacks only one type of woman and kills them with a very precise knowledge of the anatomy of the human body, he reminded me. We've also overlooked the fact that in the past, he has always killed at the end of the month and before the weekend. In this case, none of the characteristic concomitant phenomena typical of the Ripper's actions have been satisfied, no matter what the deluded Lestrade says. Whatever do you mean? I mean that it was a brutal, heinous murder, but in no way connected with Jack. Once I accepted that thesis, it allowed me to look at the case with fresh eyes. And what do you see? A handmaid who accidentally falls pregnant confides this to the couple she serves, who are striving in vain for a child of their own. A couple that cannot have children and face the threat of disinheritance by the head of the family, who demands the continuation of the family lineage. So they offer to provide a life of prosperity for her child and pay her a hefty indemnity in exchange. They will take care of her somewhere in seclusion until she gives birth. Meanwhile, the lady feigns her own pregnancy. When the handmaid hands over the newborn child as agreed, they send her away. She is not allowed to tell a soul about it if she wishes to avoid trouble herself. But then, the girl's maternal instinct is aroused, and she wants her baby back. She returns, repeatedly, to her former employer's house, offering to return all of the money, of which she hasn't spent a penny. She pleads for better or worse, and starts drinking out of sheer grief. In desperation, she even attempts to break into the house, so they summon the police. But the husband foresees that the trouble may escalate, and decides to get rid of her once and for all. Good God, I gasped. Of course, it all made sense. You saw both the corpse and the child that Lady Gladys was cradling, Holmes recalled. The Catelmans are fair-haired, almost of Anglo-Saxon type, as are all members of their family, as we could see in the portraits on the walls of the house. The child had dark hair, like Langley's. Incidentally, based on other anthropological features, she does not fit in with their clan at all. Well, still, that is no proof, I realized. Indeed, it is not. I confess that I procured the proof by employing two contrivances, he revealed. You provoked Catelman into getting rid of the evidence. I had hoped he still had the locket. Where else would it be? Perhaps, somewhat irrationally, he wanted his son to have something that belonged to his real mother. And the other ruse? I originally worked with the assumption that Catelman might be the child's father and Langley might have been his mistress. However, I noticed a letter atop a stack of papers on the table in the drawing room with an address from a woman's doctor. Unfortunately, I had to compromise medical confidentiality in order to discover the murderer, and while you were keeping watch in Hyde Park, I broke into his surgery. In the Catelman file, I learned that Lord Catelman's war injuries had taken a toll on his reproductive abilities, nor had nature been kind to Lady Gladys in this regard. It is biologically impossible for them to have a child. They cannot justify its existence. Why didn't they simply adopt a child? The orphanages are full of them. I expect old Mr. Catelman would hardly approve of such a solution. He insisted on the bloodline. The blood of the Catelman dynasty was to be preserved before the outside world by shedding the blood of the poor handmaid. It is monstrous, I said, shuddering with disgust. The worst of it is that I have no doubt the Catelmans truly and sincerely loved the child. It was the only thing they had not to pretend when they received us. What will happen to the little one now? Will he be sent to an orphanage? I dare not guess. Holmes rubbed his tired eyes and glanced out of the cab to see if we were nearing Knightsbridge. Let us get it over with. At the Catelman residence, the familiar housemaid opened the door for us. You are Lynette, are you not? Holmes addressed her sharply. Tell me quickly, if you do not wish to be held an accomplice, where his lordship was last night. At home, she cried, startled. You are lying. I swear, I brought him up valerian drops to help him sleep, she stammered. He scowled at her sternly and entered without permission. His behaviour was almost menacing. But the lady left sometime after midnight. I heard her dressing. The maid managed to gasp. My pupils dilated. So, Catelman wasn't the murderer. It was his wife? That was why it took him almost an hour to step out and get rid of the evidence. He learned of his wife's crime after our visit, and only then did he confront her. He also took from her the locket that she'd torn from Monica's neck. The master of the house appeared in the stairwell leading up from the hall. I do believe I've made myself clear, he snapped angrily. Stop harassing us. And I believe I made myself clear that your title would not stop the investigation of a murder, Holmes retorted. He then displayed the silver locket fished out from the bottom of the serpentine. Please stop shouting in here, said Lady Gladys, emerging from the drawing room bearing the swaddled child. Gladys, they know everything, sobbed the aristocrat. Let me put Cecil to bed, and then we can talk it over, the lady said, giving us a look so replete with affection that we could not refuse her. We did not believe that she would deny the facts or attempt to escape, and followed Catelman into the sitting room. In the meantime, Holmes sent the housemaid Lynette to the police station to summon a patrol. Catelman steeled himself and poured out several glasses of brandy to calm everyone down. As it was already late in the afternoon, we gladly accepted. What now? He asked with a dignified jut of his chin. We shall have to arrest you, said the detective. Both of you. And the boy? The authorities will take care of him. His mother is dead and his father is unknown. From behind our backs came a woman's calm voice, accompanied by the characteristic click of a revolver hammer, which Lord Catelman, like any proper, albeit retired soldier, surely had somewhere in the house. I will never give him up, the lady announced. Her forefinger trembled on the trigger of the heavy weapon, which she had to hold with both hands. Darling, we must be reasonable. Catelman stepped towards his wife, anxious to comfort her and take the weapon away. Unfortunately, instead of reason, Lady Gladys was overwhelmed by emotion and horror at the thought of losing her cherished child. Her mind, addled by anguish, assessed her husband's approach as an imminent threat. She turned her extended arms, grasping the Enfield Army revolver, away from us and towards Catelman, and fired blindly. There was a report. The lady staggered, and a bloodstain began to seep through the Lord's vestment in the middle of his chest, right over the heart. He never even flinched, and slumped to the ground as if his legs had been pulled from under him. There were enough bullets left in the cylinder for Lady Catelman to eliminate any obstacles and witnesses to her husband's killing at once. Holmes and myself. My friend took a step forward, shielding me from possible gunfire with his body. But his heroic gesture was unnecessary. The lady trembled and continued to clutch her weapon, but she was not going to shoot, at least not at anyone else. Staring at her hands as if in disbelief at what she'd done, she sank to her knees beside her husband's prostrate body, her eyes moist with tears. She scooped a drop of blood from his waistcoat onto her fingertips and rubbed it between her thumb and index finger. "It's over," she gasped. Then she glanced at us, agitated. "Promise me we'll have a good life," she said. And before we realized what she was doing, it was too late. Gladys Catelman took the revolver in both hands again, placed the barrel under her chin, and pulled the trigger. Whenever I drive through Knightsbridge or past Hyde Park, I remember. We did what we thought was right. When Lynette returned with the police patrol, we gave them only as much information about the two dead bodies as we deemed necessary. It was beyond us to plunge into a life of misery and misfortune a child merely several weeks old, who'd lost his mother through no fault of his own, and whose new parents had literally stepped over dead bodies to have him. We described Lord and Lady Catelman's involvement in the death of Monica Langley as the tragic culmination of a love affair and suicide to avert a scandal. Although Aberline and his men strove on for some time to link the case to Jack the Ripper, the inspector himself eventually admitted that the theory was unfeasible and confirmed Holmes's non-public conclusions of the previous year. He made an unofficial apology to my friend. Little Cecil was taken in by his only living relative, Grandfather Catelman, in good faith. It had been a very long day for Holmes and I, and we were glad it was over. I gather that it was not Catelman who took the locket from Monica, but rather his wife, for the same reason that you have ascribed to him. Lady Catelman took a great risk in going to Whitechapel alone at night, but what I don't understand is whether she mutilated Monica Langley's body to distract attention. Was she hoping we would pursue the ghost of Jack the Ripper? I mused aloud on the way home. Holmes shook his head sadly. I don't believe the lady made any such cold-blooded plans. It was all the act of a woman driven mad, he shrugged. Langley wanted to take from her that without which her life was worthless. She envied her not just that one particular child, but the ability to mother a child as such. It wasn't enough for her to kill the poor girl as a human being. She hated her for doing what she couldn't, giving birth to another life. That is why, most likely in an act of affectation, she mutilated her in the uterine region. She cut out her womb and then disposed of it somewhere. Desperate women do desperate things. At least the Ripper never actually returned, I sighed. Only in our distraught imaginations, Holmes nodded. We can both rest easy that we identified the real Jack the Ripper long ago, and that there was no mistake. The perpetration of evil has been ingrained in the nature of mankind since the days of Cain and Abel, so we shall certainly continue to encounter murders, even very heinous ones. But the perpetrators will be different, and I will never stop searching for them, he added firmly. Back in Baker Street, we had another nightcap and sat by the hearth for some time. That night, we and the residents of Whitechapel, faced by countless challenges every day of their lives, poverty, disease, inadequate sanitation, malnutrition, and more, were able to forget at least one worry and sleep soundly again. But surely no one in Monica Langley's circle would ever have dreamt that the heir to one of the nation's oldest and wealthiest noble families, who now sits in the House of Lords and co-determines their fate, has not a drop of blue blood in his veins, but instead the blood of one of their own, a murdered former housemaid and an unknown tramp. The kind reader will therefore pardon me for altering the family's real name for the purposes of this story. I do not wish to be responsible for another political scandal.